Common sense is simple, rules that keep people safe and warnings that should be obvious. But some people act dumb enough to think they're above it. In this video, we're looking at 6 of the most idiotic accidents ever, each one showing how ignoring the basics can end in disaster. It was July 4th, 2015 in Tampa, Florida. The evening sky lit with distant pops of fireworks as neighborhoods prepared for their own displays. Music, laughter, and the smell of grilled food filled backyards across the city. For one crowd of partygoers, the celebration would not end with fireworks in the sky, but with a preventable fatality witnessed up close. Daniel Morales, 27, worked long hours at a warehouse near the port. His co-workers described him as someone who loved being the center of attention, often pushing limits to get laughs. Outside of work, Daniel built his reputation on reckless dares and party stunts, convincing himself and others he was untouchable. His friends tolerated it, though most had seen him narrowly avoid serious injury before. In every gathering, Daniel competed for the loudest laugh, the biggest stunt, the stupidest idea. Fireworks, cheap and widely available in Florida, became a prop for his need to perform. He had handled mortars before, always treating them as toys rather than explosives. To him, the technical warnings stamped on every package were more like challenges than rules. That night, the party had gathered in a backyard on the edge of Tampa. Drinks flowed, music blared, and people set up folding chairs to watch their own improvised fireworks show. Several guests had bought large mortar tubes and shells, the kind designed to be set firmly in the ground before ignition. When Daniel saw them, his ego found an opening. He boasted he could launch one from the top of his head, calling it the ultimate human cannon. Some laughed nervously, others told him not to be an idiot, but he took their protests as part of the show. He ignored repeated warnings and even mocked a friend who tried to pull the mortar tube from his hands. The setup itself was already a disaster. Mortar shells are designed to shoot upward from a stable base, with their lift charge burning before the aerial burst explodes. Placing it on his head eliminated stability, made misfire almost certain, and put his skull directly against the ignition point. A few guests pulled out phones to record, thinking he might scare himself and back down. Instead, he balanced the tube, crouched for effect, and lit the fuse. The firework did not behave predictably. There was a brief sputter and a fraction of a second hesitation that some witnesses later described as a misfire. That tiny delay was followed by the lift charge detonating at point-blank range. The tube also kicked off angle, so the blast was driven directly into his skull. Witnesses later told investigators that Morales collapsed before the crowd even processed what happened. There was a split second of stunned silence after the sputter, then a deafening blast and the sight of him crumpling to the ground. Blood pooled rapidly as screams broke out across the yard. Some ran, others froze, and a few frantically dialed 911. Paramedics arrived within minutes, but there was nothing to attempt. The explosion had been fatal on impact, leaving catastrophic injuries that no intervention could address. The yard was silent except for sobbing and the fading echo of fireworks from surrounding neighborhoods. City officials didn't call a press conference for the incident. Instead, they quietly added a new line to their public safety pamphlets, citing a 27-year-old male in Hillsborough County as an unnamed example of fireworks misuse. The choice to anonymize the case angered some who wanted his story told plainly, while others thought it spared the family further embarrassment. It was August 19, 2016 in Houston, Texas. The city's late summer heat lingered even after dark, mixing with the hum of neon signs and steady traffic on the freeways. At a quiet strip mall on the edge of town, the bright lights of a 24-hour automatic car wash glowed against the night. What began as a routine stop would turn into a fatal example of what happens when impatience overrides common sense. Melissa Ramirez, 34, worked as a hairstylist in a busy salon on Westheimer Road. She was outspoken, quick to laugh, and often prided herself on cutting corners where others wouldn't. Her friends and family knew her as someone who ridiculed rules and mocked safety warnings, claiming most regulations were written for people too scared to think for themselves. That attitude bled into her daily life. From driving above the speed limit to improvising fixes for broken appliances, she rarely let caution slow her down, even when it made her look flat-out dumb to others who valued safety. The car wash environment she entered that night was simple, yet structured. Automatic washes rely on conveyor belts to pull vehicles through a tunnel of high-pressure sprayers, foam brushes, and rotating rollers. Sensors and signage exist to warn drivers not to exit once inside, since moving parts and the conveyor system pose crushing hazards. Ramirez had used the location before, but she often joked about how overly complicated the instructions were. A stupid choice in a place designed with hazards spelled out in plain sight. That evening, she drove her nephew's SUV into the wash just after midnight. He sat in the passenger seat, recording videos on his phone as the first sprays coated the windshield. But as the vehicle approached the conveyor track, the tires failed to align properly. The SUV's front wheel bounced against the guide rail and sat crooked on the belt. The system automatically paused, lights flashing red to indicate an error. Posted signs warned drivers not to exit, but Ramirez viewed the halt as a minor inconvenience rather than a serious danger. Ignoring her nephew's nervous objections, Ramirez shifted into park, opened the driver's door, and stepped out barefoot onto the wet, soapy concrete. Surveillance footage later confirmed she crouched beside the wheel, pushing against it and trying to steer it back into the groove by hand. The wash remained paused, but the rollers still dripped water, and the conveyor belt sat tense, waiting for reset. Employees in the control room had not yet noticed the misalignment, and Ramirez made no attempt to call for assistance. After a short pause, the conveyor cycled back into motion. The belt jerked forward, catching her foot and pulling her leg under the moving track. Witnesses described the suddenness as shocking. Her body yanked downward before she could react. As she struggled to pull free, one of the rotating side brushes swung forward, pinning her torso against the SUV. The mechanical force pressed with hundreds of pounds of pressure. Her nephew screamed as he scrambled out of the vehicle. Employees rushed to hit the emergency stop, but precious seconds had already passed. By the time the machinery halted, Ramirez's legs were crushed under the track, and her chest compressed. Her nephew and workers tried to free her, but the damage was catastrophic. Emergency responders arrived quickly after being called by the employees, yet her injuries left no chance of survival. The surveillance footage confirmed the sequence clearly. A preventable death caused by her decision to step into a place no one was meant to stand. In her funeral, family members spoke of her warmth and humor, but avoided the specifics of how she died. Her nephew later told relatives he could still hear her screams echoing in his head, replaying the moment she crawled out to fix a problem no one should ever touch. He admitted the image of her being pulled under stayed with him every time he passed a car wash, a reminder that his aunt's impatience and stupidity had turned a minor delay into a traumatic experience for him. It was October 3rd, 2017, in Des Moines, Iowa. The morning air carried the smell of harvest, a mix of corn dust and diesel exhaust. At a grain storage bin on the edge of town, work began as usual. But one impulsive decision would turn the day from routine labor into tragedy. Brandon Hughes, 20, worked as a farmhand for a mid-sized operation that rented storage space at the bin site. He was young, energetic, and eager to prove himself in an industry dominated by older men who preached patience and discipline. Among his peers, Hughes was infamous for brushing off safety rules and mocking the cautious habits of veteran farmers, a dumb attitude that seasoned workers quietly shook their heads at. He often bragged that regulations slowed down progress and that he could work smarter by ignoring unnecessary precautions. Grain bins are among the most dangerous work sites. Thousands of bushels can shift like liquid, pulling a person under in seconds. Though the surface looks solid, it never stops moving. Federal rules require harnesses, spotters, and locked augers before anyone enters. Hughes had heard these warnings before, but he treated them as exaggerations. That morning, Hughes and 3 co-workers were loading corn into one of the silos. As the auger pushed the grain upward and the chamber filled, he grew restless. He announced that he was going to ride the grain down, a dangerous stunt that older workers specifically cautioned against. His co-workers immediately objected, telling him it was suicide, but Hughes waved them off with a smirk. The warnings printed on the bin walls and the repeated safety meetings meant nothing to him. Instead of focusing on the conveyor, Hughes climbed up the ladder and positioned himself at the hatch. The men below shouted for him to stop, but he ignored them and leapt onto the moving surface of corn. At first, it looked like he might get away with it. He slid a few feet, laughing as the grain shifted beneath him. Then the surface gave way, and he began to sink. His laughter turned to panic in an instant. From the floor, 3 men saw him flailing as the grain acted like quicksand, pulling his legs under. They scrambled to grab ropes, shouting for him to hold on. Hughes screamed for help, clawing at the surface, but every movement only drew him deeper. Within seconds, he was buried up to his chest, then his neck. The men tried to throw a rope across, but he could not grasp it. His head disappeared beneath the shifting corn before they could reach him. The auger continued feeding grain into the bin until it was shut down manually. By then, Hughes was completely submerged. Emergency crews were called immediately, but rescue was nearly impossible. Specialized vacuum equipment was brought in to remove grain, and hours passed before they located his body deep in the chamber. He had suffocated quickly, trapped by the immense pressure of the corn above him. When rescue crews finally recovered his body hours later, the 3 men who had watched him vanish stood silent by the bin, still shaken by how quickly his laughter had turned into screaming. One of them told local reporters he felt more anger than grief because Hughes had ignored every warning shouted at him and forced them to witness something they could never forget. In farm towns around Des Moines, the story spread not as a tragic accident, but as an example of how stupidity in a grain bin leaves scars on everyone nearby. It was August 21st, 2015 in New York City. Midtown streets pulsed with late summer heat, taxis honking as streams of office workers spilled onto the sidewalks during lunch and smoke breaks. Above them, on the 18th floor of a glass-walled office tower, one employee's careless stunt would draw dozens of eyes upward before ending in a violent and irreversible fall. Rachel Simmons, 32, worked as an administrative assistant for a mid-sized insurance brokerage headquartered in the building. She had a reputation among colleagues as loud and argumentative. Her personality leaned toward impulsiveness, and she thrived on attention, whether it came from making a cutting remark in meetings or dominating casual conversations. Simmons had no tolerance for what she considered excessive caution. Co-workers often rolled their eyes when she mocked safety briefings. The office was located in an older pre-war building, with sash windows that slid open, a design newer codes discouraged on upper floors. Management skipped renovations, instead posting warnings not to lean out. On smoke breaks, Simmons and a few co-workers gathered by the window, cigarettes in hand. For her, it wasn't a hazard, but a stage. She leaned out often, yelling at cab drivers or joking with people below. Colleagues worried, but their warnings never went beyond quick remarks. On this particular afternoon, Simmons joined 2 colleagues at the window. The group smoked quietly until Simmons spotted a pedestrian who had bumped into another and sparked a minor street argument. Laughing, she leaned out further than usual, calling down sarcastic remarks. Her co-workers urged her to step back, reminding her of the height, but she waved them off. It was an idiotic bit of defiance. She insisted she knew her limits, treating the act as harmless fun. The sill was narrow, and the only thing keeping her in place was her balance on the office carpet. As the street altercation faded, Simmons searched for another opportunity to provoke a reaction. Spotting a man looking up in annoyance, she leaned farther out, twisting her torso to make a rude gesture. The motion shifted her weight awkwardly, and the balls of her feet slipped slightly backward. Witnesses inside the room froze as her body tipped past the threshold. For a moment she flailed, gripping at the frame, but her momentum carried her forward. Her co-workers' shouts drew attention from others in nearby offices, but it was too late. Simmons pitched outward, her body striking the scaffolding erected 2 floors down for exterior maintenance. No workers were present on the platform at the time. The impact slowed her descent only briefly before she spun and slammed onto the sidewalk with catastrophic force. Pedestrians screamed and scattered as the sound echoed against the buildings. Traffic halted, and dozens of bystanders crowded at a distance, horrified by what they had just seen. Paramedics arrived within minutes following a call from a pedestrian, but there was nothing to be done. The fall had caused massive trauma, and she was pronounced dead at the scene. Officers secured the area, shielding her body from gathering crowds and escorting shocked employees away from the window upstairs. Surveillance cameras from nearby shops confirmed the witnesses' accounts, showing the exact moment she toppled outward. Her funeral was held quietly in Queens. The company closed the office for 2 days, bringing in counselors for employees directly affected. City inspectors reviewed the building and mandated that all operable windows above the 10th floor be permanently restricted with safety latches. Their report concluded the accident stemmed from reckless behavior, noting that properly secured windows would have reduced the risk. It was July 23, 2016, in Beijing, China. The humid air in the evening clung to the city's underground corridors as commuters funneled through the subway system, weary from a long workday. Among the tide of faces was Darren Phillips, a foreigner who stood out not for his presence, but for what he was about to attempt. Darren was 28 from Leeds, England, and working as an English teacher at a private language academy in Beijing. His students liked him, describing him as funny and unfiltered, but colleagues knew his recklessness well. Nights out drinking often ended with foolish dares, jumping into canals, climbing onto rooftops, even attempting to race taxis on foot. For Darren, risk wasn't a challenge to overcome, but a way to show off. Alcohol blurred his judgment, and applause from others was the reward he sought. His friends had grown used to his antics, though several had stopped joining his outings, tired of the chaos he left behind. Technically, there was nothing complicated about an escalator, but that was part of the point. Darren liked taking ordinary, safe environments and turning them into stages for dangerous stunts. Escalators in Beijing's subway system were particularly long and steep, designed to move thousands quickly. Safety mechanisms were in place, emergency stop buttons, comb plates at the top and bottom, but they depended on people using the machines responsibly. That night, after heavy drinking with coworkers in a nearby bar, Darren announced he was going to beat the machine. His plan was to climb up the down escalator against the flow of dozens of tired commuters. His coworkers laughed nervously, trying to dissuade him, but Darren thrived on defiance. He charged forward, shirt half untucked, shoes loose on his feet, shouting over the noise of the station. Security guards on the concourse saw him immediately and began shouting for him to stop. He waved them off, grinning. As he advanced upward, commuters pressed to the sides, clutching their bags as Darren barreled through. The scene turned tense. His footing slipped more than once, his balance wobbling as the escalator kept pulling downward. At the halfway point, one of his coworkers tried to grab his arm, but he pulled away, laughing loudly. Guards were running up the neighboring escalator, signaling frantically. Darren ignored every warning, driven by the attention he craved. Near the top, his left shoe caught awkwardly on the moving step. He stumbled forward, striking the handrail, but instead of regaining his footing, his leg dropped into the narrowing gap where the moving steps met the comb plate. Witnesses described a sickening moment when the escalator's machinery gripped his leg and dragged it downward. The escalator continued pulling, the teeth of the comb plate crushing and tearing as commuters screamed. Dozens of people nearby pushed back in panic, some trying to shield children from the sight. Several commuters struck the emergency stop button, but the chaos delayed response by precious seconds. Guards finally reached the controls and shut the machine down, but Darren was pinned, blood pooling onto the metal steps. Emergency crews arrived quickly, forcing the escalator apart with hydraulic tools, but the damage was catastrophic. He was freed alive but gravely injured, and despite paramedics' efforts, he succumbed to his injuries shortly after extraction. His life ended by a machine that would have been harmless if used normally. In Leeds, his funeral drew only close relatives and a few former classmates. His sister delivered the only eulogy, speaking not about the stunt that killed him, but about the boy she remembered. Attendance was small, and afterward relatives admitted the atmosphere carried not just grief, but embarrassment. It was May 19, 2018 in Chicago, Illinois. The early morning quiet had just settled over a downtown residential block as guests spilled out of an apartment party. Inside the building's lobby, a group of friends waited for the elevator, unaware that a dare fueled by arrogance and alcohol was about to end in tragedy. Nicole Adams was 30 years old and worked in retail, bouncing between mall outlets and seasonal jobs. She was known among her circle not for reliability, but for her recklessness. She had a reputation for mocking rules, whether smoking where signs prohibited it or crossing busy streets against red lights. Alcohol often amplified this behavior, pushing her to escalate harmless dares into physical risks. Elevators rely on sensors, door interlocks, and mechanical brakes designed to keep passengers safe, if passengers behave normally. Light curtain sensors stop doors from closing if a person stands fully in the opening, but gaps near the frame can allow someone to wedge in without triggering them. Once the interlock clicks shut, the car can move even if part of a person's body is still pressed against the doorway. Elevators exert tremendous force when rising, and the space between the car and the shaft is a lethal trap. The party had stretched past midnight, and by the time Nicole and her friends reached the lobby, alcohol dulled their judgment. As the group waited, Nicole spotted the elevator doors sliding open and made a show of standing in the threshold. Laughing, she announced that she would ride the elevator doors. Her friends pleaded with her to stop, but she treated their concern as fuel. When the doors began closing, she wedged herself in, gripping the frame with one arm while the car filled with other guests. Security cameras captured the moment. Nicole smiling, shoulders half inside the car, half out, while her friends looked on in mounting alarm. Warnings came fast. A friend tried tugging her back, another pressed the button to hold the door, but Nicole twisted free, insisting she was fine. The doors closed against her torso, the sensors failing to trip because she hugged the frame instead of standing squarely in the opening. Inside the car, passengers yelled for her to step fully in or out. A second later, the elevator began its upward motion with Nicole still wedged in the doorway. Witnesses described the shift from laughter to panic in an instant. As the car rose, Nicole's footing slipped. Her torso pulled tighter between the moving car and the shaft wall. Her arm twisted unnaturally as the force dragged her upward. Passengers inside pounded the emergency buttons and screamed for help, but the car continued its rise. Within seconds, her body was caught in the narrowing gap, and the crushing pressure became fatal. By the time the elevator halted between floors, the damage was catastrophic. First responders called by her friends arrived within minutes, forcing the doors open with specialized tools. What they found left no room for doubt. Nicole had been killed instantly by blunt force and compression injuries. Nothing could be done. A few days later, city officials confirmed the elevator's safety systems had worked as intended, placing full responsibility on misuse. Inspectors noted no mechanical fault, only reckless behavior. Police kept the security footage restricted, but word of its contents circulated among residents. Local aldermen faced complaints about building oversight, though inspectors emphasized that no modification could prevent someone deliberately forcing themselves into a closing doorway. Thanks for watching. If these stories of recklessness and death entertained you, click here for more.